when looking at the PLA, it's a mistake to, think of all of the elements of the PLA as sort of the same thing. That the troops are the same thing as the Navy, which is the same thing as the rocket force. How should we be what is the difference in capabilities of these different segments of the PLA? Because obviously, as you're saying, even within the U.S. military, there are some pretty big differences.
Right. I think there's been a focus from our China hands that they've understood and followed the China military going back 30 years since Tiananmen. Those were most of the experts that you had on your show referenced. And they constantly talk about the PLA, the Army, not the whole service, but the People's Liberation Army that was Xi kind of broke out in 2015 as he reorganized the PLA writ large. And their views of the Army date back to the Tiananmen era and this idea that they're kind of some Keystone Cops and they don't really have good training. They don't have good material readiness, and they're stovepiped and they're not integrated as a joint force. And I think those ideas and assessments are incorrect, first of all. But second, they don't apply to each service equally. So while the Army may be the remnants of the Army system may still be being transformed in this military modernization effort over the last 2.5 decades. The places that have really made advances are in areas like the Strategic Rocket Force, the PLA Air Force, the PLA Navy, where we see them operating together in joint operations far from home, doing exercises where they transport troops across the nation into other countries. Now we see Y-20 transport aircraft. So they're learning power projection. They're accelerating their learning at a rate that took us decades and decades to learn, and they're learning them in years, in rapid time. And I think when you see the PLA Navy operate at sea, one of the things that we used to say back in when I joined the Navy in 1986, we used to talk about the Soviets, and the Soviet Navy would sit at anchorage in certain parts of the Mediterranean and other parts, because they didn't have the fuel, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the operational costs to be able to go out and operate like the U.S. Navy. And we always recognize that even in peacetime, when we operated carriers, the carriers that I served on, we were flying and conducting operations as if we were in combat. To launch an aircraft every 45 seconds and recover it every 2 minutes, when depending on when your launch and recovery cycle. That kind of capability to do that is something that you would do in combat. Landing a jet fighter on an aircraft carrier at night in pitching seas in the South China Sea in peacetime and wartime are very, very similar. Now, they're different, no question about it, but the core skills of being able to execute and to conduct combat operations in peacetime is what we were doing. We were training to that. So now we see the PLA Navy doing the same thing. They're spending a lot of time at sea. Now, are they as good as us in the same certain areas? No, but they haven't built their Navy to be exactly like ours. That's why their carrier program is behind their submarine program and their surface ship program, because they put a lot of money and effort into this counter-intervention or anti-access area denial strategy, which says our main goal is to seize Taiwan and to be able to keep the U.S. military from coming in and supporting Taiwan. So they built a force, a naval force, and a rocket force, and an air force that were designed to do just that. But we're now at this inflection point after 25 years of modernization where their ability to pull off an invasion of Taiwan becomes more likely as each day goes by. It would be naive to think that force that they're building, especially when they're building Y-20 transport planes and new long-range bombers and hypersonic missiles and all the other things that they're doing, to think that their force is just going to stay confined inside the first island chain. That's naive. We know that they're not going to do that. They've told us that their Belt and Road Initiative is a global initiative, and they're operating forces farther and farther afield than they have 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And that's only going to increase. So sooner or later, they're going to be on our front doorstep in Hawaii and in San Diego, and by all accounts, probably on the East Coast with some of the activities that they're having with Latin American countries and setting up bases on the West Coast of Africa and research operations and things that they're doing. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm still banging the drum that the Chinese military is growing and their ability to project power is something that we need to respect. But right now, they have the capability to, a lot of people are very afraid that they could take Taiwan. And I think that's something that we need to get down to right now. What are we going to do right now today?
Well, that's very interesting because one of the common criticisms of the PLA is that they lack fighting experience. The last time they were in a war was in Vietnam, 1979, I believe. So, in the event of a Taiwan invasion, could they really do that? Considering the U.S. military does have decades of active experience.
Yeah, we have active experience operating in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but we don't have active experience in the naval arena. So the last time the United States Navy was involved, the Marine Corps was involved in amphibious operations, was in 1950 in the Korean War. So we haven't operated for 72 years in a maritime invasion scenario like that. We do practice humanitarian assistance, disaster relief operations, but you just saw here just recently with the volcanic explosion in Tonga, we were only able to dispatch a destroyer, and the Chinese right now, as we're talking, have a large deck amphibious helicopter carrier and a resupply ship, two big deck platforms that are out resupplying Tonga. So China's been slowly activating and getting trained in these kind of naval operations for the last 2 decades. And so I think we discount that. We talk about, I saw it also at this AFCEA conference, apparently a retired four-star made some comment about they don't have any experience, that maybe a little skirmish on the Indian border. But what we discount is the fact that the Chinese military has been operating inside their country, doing huge force movements and movement of, like we just saw today, main battle tanks from the Nanjing military region, which is on the east coast of Shanghai, and moving them out into the Gobi Desert, hundreds of tanks to do an exercise out there, or moving, airborne corps troops around the country, or fortifying the Indian border. And as I said, they're starting to push out into Afghanistan maybe, and into Pakistan and other areas. So I think what we're seeing is this idea that we are outmoded thinking that says that they're really the PLA of the 1990s or 2000s, early 2000s, and we're not giving them the kind of credit that they deserve for what they've done over the last two and a half decades. And that's where my big trouble is, with that we kind of say they don't have experience, but we have experience. Well, we had experience in conducting an airlift out of Afghanistan, and we took 100,000, 125,000 people out. Well, that's not combat. That's a retreat. Okay. So that there is some experience there to fly aircraft in and put a bunch of people on them. But that's not combat experience. And it's certainly no equivalent to what would occur to defend Taiwan. I mean, when I saw that four-star used as an example to say and proudly boast, yeah, we're the U.S. military, we're so strong, we were able to airlift 125,000 people out of Kabul. I'm thinking, well, if I'm in Taiwan, are you telling me that that's what you're going to do? You're going to airlift out hundreds of thousands of Americans, and that's your military plan? I mean, we need to have something much different. We need to have a strategy and a plan and the capabilities to be able to say, if China tries to take Taiwan, we're going to break their fingers off and break their knuckles. And we don't have anybody speaking like that.
Well, so that's very, very interesting because from what you're saying, like the U.S. Navy's main experience is not, it hasn't been like combat experience really since World War II. Most of the U.S. Navy's experience comes through these regular training exercises on sea, because combat on sea is very similar to just being active on the sea. And that sounds pretty similar to China's Navy at this point. So really, from how you're framing it, the U.S. Navy and the PLA Navy are kind of on the same level of experience.
I think it depends. If you talk about carrier airborne operations, no, we're way ahead of them. We still operate our carriers at sea, and we have many more jet aircraft on our aircraft carriers, and we can do a lot more, and we're much more effective. But when you're operating your carrier under the envelope of a DF-21D or a DF-26 anti-carrier ballistic missile, that's a different story when combined with Chinese submarines and surface ships that have long-range anti-ship cruise missiles that are coming in like this from all different directions, while you're worrying about also airborne, launched anti-ship cruise missiles coming in from the PLA Air Force, and all at once you're being attacked from a missile system that you never worried about. We fought in off of Afghanistan in 2003, 2004, 2005, Operation Enduring Freedom. Our carriers, 4 or 5 carriers, set off of the coast of Afghanistan, and people were eating ham sandwiches and reading magazines, figuratively, while their pilots were launching and going and dropping bombs in Afghanistan. We kind of did the same thing in Desert Storm in Iraq in 1991. So we've never been in an environment where our aircraft carriers are having to operate while they're being attacked by a peer competitor. Let's see how we do when all of a sudden our air operations have to fight with a contingency of a truckload of anti-ship cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, anti-carrier ballistic missiles, and finding, if you're on an aircraft carrier, you have to find out where are all the enemy submarines, where are all the enemy surface ships, where are all the enemy aircraft, and oh, by the way, where are these ballistic missiles that are coming in? And you got to find and figure out all those while you're also concurrently figuring out, how do I get off this carrier? How do I get to a tanker? And then how do I get to what target am I going to attack? Because are we going to attack the Chinese mainland, or are we going to attack their ships? We spent the last 30 years figuring out how to target and fight fixed targets on land. Some mobile targets, high-value individual terrorists in trucks and things of that nature. But a lot of that was done with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that were orbiting over, town X in Iraq or Afghanistan, where you had precise intelligence and said, there is that precise bad guy, and I'm going to zap him because I know exactly where he is. Whereas you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you're like, where are their ships? Where are their submarines? And how am I going to get lead on them to sink them? So one of the discussions that's never really discussed in the defense circles and the China hand circles is the vast difference between the last 30 years of war over land and war in the desert versus war at sea. And when I joined the U.S. Navy was a war at sea Navy. We were 100% focused on fighting the Soviet Navy globally around the world. And that focus has changed in 30 years. And we are not getting it back, and not quick enough. Certain people get it. No, don't get me wrong. It's changing, but it's not changing enough. It's not changing rapidly because we don't have the kind of intellectual capacity and the political leaders that we have that really are preaching this. We don't have a president or a secretary of defense that's come in and said, we have to do this, and here's what we're going to do to get back to being a naval power and a maritime nation that can control the seas. And this idea that you can take the force that's been built to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq and just transfer it to the Taiwan scenario or the Senkaku scenario or the South China Sea scenario, that's just not going to happen. They're not the same. And people do not talk about that. So when I hear analysts say, well, they're inexperienced and they don't know what to do. Well, that may be in a ground war against Vietnam or a ground war against India, but it's not the same, as you said, in a naval conflict over Taiwan. At that point, we're at parity now because nobody in the U.S. Navy that's serving today served in those times. Now, there's maybe 1 or 2 guys, but it's not driving the Defense Department's budgeting resources, the allocation of people and prioritization, the promotions of people, the innovation and which technologies that we need. China's got this whole system of missiles that they've deployed on their naval ships and submarines and aircraft, specifically designed and built to sink the U.S. Pacific Fleet. We are still thinking and transitioning from dropping bombs in the desert to how do we find and sink Chinese ships and submarines and aircraft at sea? And people are working on that, but it's on the fringes of the Defense Department. It's in small science projects and things of that nature. And it's not really a holistic, wholesale, this is a new threat, stop everything we've been doing and get on this.